Today's topic is using congruent triangles. And what we're going to be doing is we're looking at this diagram and we're going to be doing a two-column proof. You're given the side QP is congruent to side QR. So let's mark that. And the side PS is congruent to side RS, so we'll also mark that. And we'd like to prove that angle PQS is congruent to angle RQS. Now, this is how we're going to approach this. If we can prove that the two triangles are congruent, then it makes sense that their corresponding parts are congruent. And I'm going to actually pull this slide down, and you're probably seeing this on your paper. This is the concept that corresponding parts of congruent triangles are congruent, and we just call this CPCTC. So if we can prove two triangles are congruent, then it automatically follows that their corresponding parts have to be congruent. This is what we're talking about here. So let's see if we can do this. We're going to start by listing the statements and the reasons. So number one, let's just write down our given information that QP is congruent to QR. That's given. That PS is congruent to RS. That's also given. And now let's see. We want to show that these triangles are congruent. Well, look at this. The triangles share a side. They share the common side of QS. So we can say that QS is congruent to QS. Anytime anything's congruent to itself, that is the reflexive property. And now we have enough information to show that these two triangles are congruent by side, side, side. So we know that triangle PQS is congruent to triangle RQS by side, side, side. But that's not what we were trying to prove. We wanted to show that these angles, angle PQS, was congruent to triangle RQS, or I'm sorry, was congruent to angle RQS. Angle PQS congruent to angle RQS. Well, if the triangles are congruent, the corresponding angles are also congruent. So we can automatically say the angle PQS is congruent to angle RQS by what I was alluding to earlier, that corresponding parts of congruent triangles are congruent. Remember, that's what we said was we're going to call CPCTC. Going right down here, corresponding parts of congruent triangles have to be congruent. So if the triangles are congruent, the corresponding angles also have to be congruent. So this is something we're going to be using quite a bit. Let's move on. Here's another two-column proof. Let's say that you're given that A is the midpoint of MT and SR. And we want to prove that MS is congruent to TR. So let's see if we can prove these two triangles congruent, and then we can prove the corresponding parts congruent using CPCTC. So let's start with the statements and the reasons. Always start with your given information. A is the midpoint of MT and SR. The reason we can say that is its given information. Well, if A is the midpoint of MT and SR, just because of the definition of a midpoint, that means that MA has to be congruent to AT, and it also means that SA has to be congruent to AR. And we can write all of that in the same statement if you want. We can say that MA has to be congruent to AT, and we'll just put a colon in between them. SA is congruent to AR. And both of those statements are because of the definition of midpoint. A midpoint cuts a segment into two congruent segments. All right. Now, as I said, we're trying to prove these triangles are congruent first. Well, look at this. MAS has got to be congruent to RAT, those angles, because they're vertical angles. So, let's write that down. Angle MAS has to be congruent to angle TAR because vertical angles are congruent. We can call that the vertical angles theorem or just write down vertical angles. That's fine. So now, do we have enough to show those two triangles are congruent? We certainly do because we have side, angle, side. Side, angle, side. So let's write that down. So triangle MAS is congruent to triangle TAR by side, angle, side. Now, if the triangles are congruent, the corresponding sides have to be congruent. So that means what we're trying to prove, MS has to be congruent to TR. So let's write that down. So MS must be congruent to TR. And the reason is corresponding parts of congruent triangles are congruent. So that's our CPCTC. If the triangles are congruent, the corresponding parts are congruent. We're just abbreviating it. So that is it for today. Thank you very much.